Terrific. I think we're going to start from here. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. We're going to kick this off. I think this is going to be a super exciting session today. So again, my name is Stuart Orr. I'm the head of freshwater at WWF, and we welcome you to this session today on ambitious nature-based solutions. We've got some great speeches and examples for you today. And I think just to set this up is just the context of where we are. I think every passing day, each one of us is not just through Stockholm Water Week, but in the news, hearing more about extreme floods, droughts, storms, and clearly with the new IPCC report warning us that the worst is yet to come. So this session today will focus on the urgent need to develop a pipeline of ambitious, large-scale nature-based solutions to build more resilience, economies, and ecosystems. And we're going to showcase some that are being developed. So again, the IPCC report is made it crystal clear. It has underlined what I think many of us have already known, that water is at the heart of this climate challenge and crisis. And this, of course, echoes what we learned earlier this year from the Global Commission on Adaptation report, which concluded that the impacts of climate change would most immediately and acutely be expressed through water. So clearly, we need to enhance the way we manage our rivers, lakes, and wetlands if we're going to build resilience. And we have to build and prepare for that climate reality. Yet we cannot afford to do that at the expense of nature, because the world is also facing not just a climate crisis, but a biodiversity crisis as well. And the biodiversity crisis is the most acute in freshwater systems. We've lost 84% of our freshwater species populations since 1970. And a third of our remaining wetlands over that same period of time. So of course, one answer here is nature-based solutions that can restore the health of freshwater ecosystems and help to build more resilient societies and economies. We also recognize that NBS must solve societal challenges, but that's exactly where we are today. We can help manage and mitigate the worst of floods and build greater resilience and storage capacity for droughts that serve people and planet. But the scale of the climate and nature crisis means that our ambitions and investments, they need to be big. So large-scale NBS for adaptation, initiatives that take a landscape level approach to building resilience faster. And that large scale is exactly what's at the heart of some of the most ambitious regional initiatives. If you look at Resilient Nation Deltas, Blue Heart of Africa, or Living European Rivers. And yet we still know that there's not enough funds for climate adaptation. We'd like to see more money, at least 50% of public climate finance directed to adaptation. And while some countries like the US and the UK are pledging more funds to climate adaptation, there still needs to be a pipeline of ambitious NBS for them to fund and be ready to go. So today we're going to showcase a number of these potential large-scale NBS examples, from Zambia's Lukanga swamps to the Mekong Delta, that we think could start to provide a pipeline of these projects for funding. And we'll discuss how they were developed in collaboration with governments, private sector, and communities. And with that, we're going to start in Africa with 3 very impressive NBS case studies that seek to tackle very different societal challenges. And with that, I'd like to give the floor over to Bregja. Bregja, please introduce yourself and lead your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm Brechtje van Wezenbeek, and I'm working for Deltares and the Delft University of Technology. And today I will talk a little bit about, let's get it in presenters mode, about some examples of nature-based solutions. I'm not there yet. Yeah, there we go. About some examples of nature-based solutions and how it can be done, because everybody is asking in the world these days, how can we upskill these solutions? We have some pilot projects. Can we apply them across landscape scales? And where do they work and where don't they work? So basically, I think it's important to realize that nature-based solutions fit in the whole portfolio of intervention measures that can be done, and that they can fit in any environment, and that they can actually help to mitigate multiple hazards and work against and help in climate change adaptation. So we have examples now already from urban environments, fluvial, so in rivers, and from coastal environments. But there are also examples, for example, in mountainous areas where nature-based solutions help to reduce erosion. Many examples basically focus on flood risk and coastal erosion, and on retaining water and buffering against storms, waves, and currents. So for Africa, there's 3 examples that we've looked at and that we highlighted in Rwanda, in Zambia, and in Kenya. And I'm starting out with the Rwanda. I will describe them shortly. And it's basically about using ecosystems or reviving, rehabilitating ecosystems that are already there and that used to be there and it used to be present, and integrating them in helping to mitigate flood events. So this is Rwanda, and this is one of Kigali's main roads. And this is what happens during high intensity rainfall in this area. This is what happens to the roads, and it basically, it's high intensity rainfall that generates runoff from the surrounding hills. And these roads intersect different parts of the city, but are situated in lower areas where there were former wetlands that are now actually are reclaimed for industrial development. Land use management on several of these hillsides cause extra siltation that clogs stormwater runoff and reduces capacity for water discharge. So during the last 25 years, the amount of urban area in Kigali has tripled. So also the amount of impervious surface has tripled, of course. So basically, wetlands can constitute a big part of the solution here. And what needs to happen is to actually rehabilitate the wetlands. And the government make the big plan. The wetlands serve for stormwater runoff. They're in the lower areas of the city. But they also serve as a sort of sponge, and they infiltrate, so they retain water, but they also take care of infiltration and to recharge groundwater resources. So the government and several international donors made plans actually to rehabilitate a lot of these wetlands. And you see the dark green areas here, that is rehabilitation wetland areas. So there's extensive wetland areas, and the rehabilitated wetland areas connects to still present wetland areas. So an example where that is already now going on is the Gikondo wetland area. Here you see it in 2018. There was industrial settlement in this wetland that has been reallocated. They did that in 2020, you see it here. And then several modeling studies were done to see how the wetland could best be rehabilitated, either in parts with natural or herbaceous vegetation, or also in parts with sort of halophyte filters that would filter water and reduce pollution. So for the way forward here, we made some recommendations, and basically it would be to scale up, which is now happening, to other wetlands across the city, but also to other wetlands outside the city, and to connect with these wetlands outside the city. And then the other recommendation would be to enhancement of biodiversity benefits. So right now, the wetland is rehabilitated, but there's no attention for indigenous species and how to rehabilitate indigenous species. So we thought many biodiversity benefits and natural benefits could be derived if more attention was paid to that. And then, as with all MBS, I mean, it should be a catchment approach, right? So it shouldn't be about only the wetlands in a lower area. To avoid erosion, to avoid extreme runoff, upstream land use management is extremely important. So it's the way you do agriculture in the upstream parts and along the hillsides, but it's also not building on all hillsides, reducing impervious areas as asphalt roads, but also buildings keeping enough infiltration capacity, sometimes reforestation or restoration of hillside ecosystems. So the second case, this was basically the most developed case where really already rehabilitation efforts were going on. For the second case, it's a bit less developed. Definitely less attention has been for this wetland, while it's a very important wetlands in the heart of wetland area in the heart of Africa, and it's extremely important for Zambia. And it's called the Lukanga swamp, and it's surrounded by hillsides. It's situated in the Kafue River basin, and 50% of Zambia's population lives in this river basin. The water in these wetlands is used for drinking water, irrigation, for agriculture, and for hydropower. So it has extremely important functions for the economy of Zambia. This swamp is actually a very important source for water in the Kafue River, as it provides the base flow for the Kafue River. And thereby it also functions as a sponge. So in wet periods and wet years, it retains a lot of water, and it actually slowly releases this water in drier periods and during dry years. The wetland has a high value for biodiversity. It's a Ramsar site, and it provides livelihood for all people that live in the area, and that amounts to almost up to 1 million people in terms of charcoal, wood cutting, of course, and but also fisheries as a water source for agriculture. However, the status of the wetland currently is not it's slightly degrading because of mining in the area. So there's a lot of pollution, but also the accommodation space and the retention capacity of the wetland is reducing because of encroachments on the site, because of siltation, again, by uphill land use management, and also because of the presence of invasive weeds that now cover 50% of the wetland area already. So eutrophication and siltation are enormous problems that reduce capacity here. So what we did is focus more on the economic case. There's very important private beneficiaries from the wetland that derive revenues directly from wetland services. There's also there's direct services, and there's more indirect services for the local communities and the national government, of course. So the private users are the drinking water company of Lusaka, ZESCO, which is the hydropower energy company, and Zambia Sugar, and of course flood regulation and downstream communities, and the DRR agency, which is a government that derive direct benefits. We looked into an average dry year and made a quick economic evaluation of losses for private companies that would amount to up to 40 million then for an average dry year. And of course, in this area also with climate change, extremes are going to be, or there are going to be more extremes between dry and wet years. So the function of the wetland is actually becoming more important in the future to sustain these services. And then there are several indirect services for local communities. I'm going to skip to them a bit quicker. And for the national government in terms of CO2 capture and meeting climate targets and biodiversity. So there's a good economic case to make for it. So we thought there's also, if a lot of people profit from it and through these revenue streams, you could also make a case for to derive funding and a financial case for sources that people that profit from the wetland also contribute to its rehabilitation and management in the future. So the recommendation for the way forward, there's ongoing development of a plan, so like a larger scale, like a master plan for protection and conservation of the Lukanga swamp, but it's important to integrate it and make it cross-sectoral so that the swamp can be a sort of nature-based solution to safeguard its ecosystem services that private and communities derive from it. So what's urgently needed is a funding and financial plan to make this happen. Examples are, for example, happening in South Africa, where they make for Cape Town water provisioning, they made a big water funds. So those are good examples that could be exchanged. Creating the enabling institutional environment is needed to actually safeguard this lake and its function, and to work out an elaborate investment need and need plan. So the least developed case that we looked into was Kenya, and looking at the coastal ecosystem, and we started looking at mangroves. But one of the things that is immediately striking is that there's a range of ecosystems that are not only coastal, and you see the picture here of Mombasa, and you see in many coastal areas of Kenya, there's reefs that then actually safeguard the mangroves that are behind it. But there's also upstream wetlands. So there's in this whole basin, of course, again, it's important to seek for the linkages between these different ecosystems and take a basin approach, because only working on mangroves on the front will not solve it. And and for example, if you look here at Mombasa, you already see that what happened during the last years is of course, extreme encroachment into natural areas, extreme development of city areas, and the Mombasa Island that you see in the middle is the most flood-prone area, and you see it in one of the pictures. Flooding is an immense problem, and degradation of these coastal ecosystems as well. So overall, Kenya has mangroves over most of its coastal area. It has, we looked at mangrove in 5 of the coastal counties at mangrove cover, but it has reduced severely for the last, I think, 30 years. It has a reduction of about 20% we found from Earth observation images. And we quickly scanned through areas where mangroves actually can provide an important role in coastal protection in combination with reefs in certain cases. I'm not going to talk about each of these areas, but mainly what can be done is in certain areas there's encroachment from the back for more like for aquaculture development, which actually may be expanded in the future. There's good integrated aquaculture development between which is mangrove based or more sustainable ways that have similar profits. We made some overall recommendations for this area again, which we said the remaining ecosystems in the area can already play an important role in the climate resilience, but also in disaster risk reduction right now. The linkages here between the upstream, the downstream, and the catchment and the coast will reduce in the largest reduction of future risk. Also, one of the recommendations, ecosystems require time and space to develop. And of course, the encroachments of ecosystems is a large problem and requires spatial planning, which actually, and zoning measures. So for Kenya, the interesting thing is that we find the legal and regulatory framework to have the right incentive is mostly in place, but plans should probably combine. Right now, one of the ways forward would be to combine top-down, so conservation and spatial planning, with bottom-up results. So more creating awareness, community involvement approach would likely work best here. And the final recommendation is to set up a mangrove and coral reef monitoring network to actually see if efforts that are happening on the ground are profitable and are paying off, and also to monitor the status of these systems and take care that that interventions can be taken if there's future degradation. Some generic recommendations out of these. Well, overall, we, of course, and MBSs that are already in place in many areas is only the question of conserving and rehabilitating. And they provide low regret and cost-effective solutions that already derive profit right now, and those profits may get lost in the future. So it's important to conserve these systems. For that, we also find that they should not only be conserved for a biodiversity point of view, but it really will work better if they're fully integrated with present infrastructure. For example, with stormwater runoff, like you see in Kigali, or for Kenya with flood risk reduction infrastructure, and with future coastal development. So one of our recommendations was also to have a South-South community of learners for sharing best practices and sharing experiences. So, for example, that the Lukanga wetlands can actually interact with the South Africa Cape Town case. So to set up similar, also on a technical level, exchange information, but also on institutional and socioeconomic level. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahia. That was great. Great examples of connecting into societal challenges. If you can stop sharing your screen, please. And I'm going to hand it over to Justine. Justine's going to give us examples from the Mekong region. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm really excited to join you all today and to be able to share some of our ongoing work with WWF, EcoShape, and Royal Haskening.
The gaps that might be there and fill in those gaps.
And just to let you know, this is a project that is currently underway, and we're actively workshopping with a team that spans from Asia to Europe to the US. And I'm an architect and planner with One Architecture based in New York. Okay. This project is to identify nature-based solutions for the Mekong Delta, and it's part of WWF's larger Resilient Asian Deltas initiative. The vision of RAD is that long-term resilience of the Delta systems is secured through unprecedented political and financial investment in nature-based solutions or building with nature, which will protect and restore the natural riverine and coastal processes that replenish deltas to sustain the societies, economies, and nature that depend on them. And our study, the Mekong Delta study, is focused on identifying opportunities for transformative NBS. We're looking at proposals with wider applicability, both within Vietnam and the other Asian river deltas. And we're currently in the first phase of identifying case studies and sites for flood management and sedimentation enhancing along river corridors and sustainable coastal zone management and erosion prevention. And after this first phase of site development, we will look at implementation pathways and the enabling environment and begin engaging with local stakeholders. I'm going to very briefly talk about the project context and then dive into one of the two cases. The Mekong Delta comprises an extremely fertile landscape that has historically led the agricultural production of Vietnam. And today, while the cities in the Delta continue to grow, the total regional population is declining. The Delta is sinking and shrinking due to natural processes that are accelerated by upstream dams, sand mining, poor water resource management, and coastal erosion combined with sea level rise. And our process as a team began with synthesizing and visualizing key natural systems and dynamics in the Delta. We began with population dynamics. I'm going to run very quickly. We mapped the water flows, including not only the tributaries and the river network, but also the extensive canal system that supports the farming that's taking place. And we looked at sediment movements to understand how much sediment the system supplies, even in spite of the upstream dams. Since one of the key challenges in the Delta is subsidence, and that's taking place at a rate 3 times faster than sea level rise, we needed to understand whether the supply of sediment is sufficient for any measures proposed, such as mangrove restoration and regeneration along the coasts. Sand mining presents another challenge that's reshaping the Delta and impacting habitats, particularly as sand for construction becomes scarcer and the urban populations are expanding. And the management of freshwater resources, including understanding the rationales for groundwater pumping, is central to the challenges with land subsidence. Rethinking surface water management will be essential to sustainable development more broadly, particularly in a region that's projected to get less rainfall with climate change. And finally, we visualized salinity, recent salinity measurements and projected salinization and subsidence impacts to better understand the scale at which changes are underway. Through this initial series of workshops and conversations, we've selected at this point 2 focus areas in Dong Thap province. We've selected a site to study for sediment and flood management. And on the Cà Mau Peninsula in Cà Mau province, we're looking at coastal zone management. So for today, I'm just going to focus on Dong Thap, given the limited time. And the case studies ultimately will condense our work into these 5 components. The goal is to articulate the interventions and provide a high-level justification for future investment. Our process involves holding regular workshops where we collaborate in a virtual whiteboard space. This is a kind of messy behind the scenes of what's actually taking place. It's highly iterative, and it's bringing together expertise from the WWF team, which is based in Vietnam and elsewhere, and our Royal Haskinen colleagues in Vietnam and the Netherlands, along with the One Architecture team based in the US and China. This draft stakeholder map begins to visualize relationships and responsibilities. It will ultimately be complemented by a stakeholder opportunities map that connects these groups to projected benefits. Our focus area centers on the Tramchim National Park, which is located in the northern edge of the Delta. Throughout the region, farms have constructed dikes around their rice paddies, which you can see in the gray and yellow line work. More recently, certain areas have witnessed the construction of full dikes, which hold back flooding in the wet season to facilitate a third rice crop. But we start to see that it comes at a price. The rice is not as productive as was hoped, and the lack of seasonal flooding means that sediment movements never reach the farmlands. Not only does the sediment help counteract subsidence, the floodwaters flush out the acidity of the soils in this area, and the land is ultimately less fertile without its cycles of flooding and drying. Our draft proposal seeks to build on the existing national park and create a ring of pilot investment sites that can make the parklands functionally larger. We are looking at the existing dike system as the unit of action, or the unit of measurement for this project. And we say that because it's kind of the minimum scale for decisions about water management, from the levels to shared regulation of surface water resources to solid waste strategies. So at this moment, it's very high level and conceptual, but I think understanding local stakeholder needs and priorities to eventually achieve buy-in, and that has to be the foundation for all of this work. Only when we begin to talk to stakeholders can we think about sustainable agriculture practices that might increase productivity, or alternative livelihoods that might compensate for the third rice crop, or more dynamic water level management for sedimentation and habitat creation. And finally, I'll just conclude with a note about our methods. We prioritize site-specific information and focus on translating sometimes abstract ideas into concrete and spatial concepts. We find that this approach accommodates and visualizes context information from a range of sources and centers on the development of design propositions as the key tool of communication, stakeholder buy-in, scoping, project structuring, and funding. So using the landscapes makes contextual issues and challenges concrete, and it facilitates a systematic approach to problem solving, systemic approach to problem solving, and allows for a better determination of appropriate scale for these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. That was excellent. Great examples. Really appreciate that. We're going to go to our next speaker, Bernard. But before we do, can I just remind the people who are joining us today that if you have any questions for any of the panelists that you're going to hear today, please put them in the Pathable chat box, not the Zoom chat box. So any comments or questions you may have into Pathable, and we will pass them on. Bernard, the floor is over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Let me present myself and Aqua Publica Europea. So my organization is the organization of the public water operators from Europe. So we have 66 members from different countries, and we served every day around 80 million citizens. I am the chairman of it, and I am as well chairman of Vivaqua, which is the public water company of Brussels, Belgium, where I am also the deputy mayor in one of the communes of Brussels. So thanks a lot for your invitation. I'm particularly happy and motivated to participate in this seminar, even more after what we have lived in Europe this summer. From the dramatic flooding that affected some northern countries, including the country I'm talking from, Belgium, to the extreme and unprecedented heat wave that affected the Mediterranean region, literally all European citizens have lived this summer the deleterious effect of climate change. As the recent IPCC reports make clear without doubt, these events will only increase in the near future, and with the most extreme growth much faster than expected in previous reports. This is a very scary scenario, and water operators are at the forefront of the fight against climate change, as they are the first ones that have to deal with the consequence of too much or too little water. In front of the magnitude and speeds of climate change that we experienced this summer, water operators must probably change their strategy and even their mission. Traditionally, water operators in Europe have been essentially engineering companies dealing with pipes and treatment plants. This is no longer allowed. Water operators must become ecosystemic enterprises. We need to go back to nature to deal with the consequence of what we made to nature. That's why, as Aqua Publica Europea, we are working hard and fully committed to promote and improve our use of nature-based solutions. Let me make an example from the city I'm talking for, Brussels. A city where each year the quantity of water passing through the sewage network is twice as much as the water that is actually consumed, and which is a situation that is worsening due to the increase of extreme rainfall. Extreme rainfalls, as we know, have several negative consequences. They generate huge pollution of river bodies, they create disruptions and damages to building and activities, and when extreme like this summer, they can cause casualties. The traditional solutions in the cities and built areas is to build big underground retention tanks, which increase the storage capacity for exceeding stormwater. Also in Brussels, we have been investing in new retention tanks for decades. But this gray solution is not allowed and eventually pose problem. It is very expensive, creates long disruptions, emits a lot of CO2 due to the use of concrete, and is eventually not smart because cannot adapt to evolving rainfalls. Nature-based solutions, for example, by de-waterproofing the soil and increase the nature absorption capacity, are definitely a better, more efficient and less expensive solution. For example, in my municipality, we are laying new pavements that allow water to infiltrate the ground, and we are setting up storm gardens in the public space to increase water retention in the soil. This is, of course, on the slides, a very small, very little example, but this has to be scaled up to the entire city. If these solutions are better and less expensive, why are they not used more at this time? At least in Europe, it's the complexity of the administrative and institutional system that makes things more complicated. It's also the lack of awareness and political will. These solutions require coordination between different administration, different expertise, different financial sources and flows, and these options must be in the mental landscape of the decision makers. In short, and as Justine Shapiro showed about the Mekong Delta, we need cooperation and partnership between different actors and stakeholders, including from civil society organizations who are often those who force the change of mindsets. That's why I'm particularly happy to be here to cooperate with the WWF and all the stakeholders, also in the framework of the European project, to create the networks of actors that are needed to scale up the resort to nature-based solutions, to make this solution more and more a new normality and of how we manage our water resources and our lands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. That was a really excellent example. I appreciate that very much. What we're going to do now is you're going to hear from the three presenters on a panel, and joining them on that panel are two other speakers today. Isabel Mukalabe, who is the Chief Conservation Officer of WWF Zambia, is with us. Welcome, Isabel. And Andre Fourie, who is the Global Water Director of Anheuser-Busch InBev, AB InBev, is also joining us today on the panel. Welcome to you, Andre. Glad you're both with us. I want to start out actually with a question to you, Isabel, if I can, because one of the case studies that we have just heard about is the Lukanga swamps. I would love to hear from you. Is there support in Zambia for these kinds of large-scale nature-based solutions from what you're hearing?
Thank you, Stuart. Hello to that, yes, that there is growing government support in terms of accepting the relevance of nature-based solutions, basically to not only just address aspects of restoring the Lukanga in terms of its ecosystem function, but more broadly understanding the role of nature-based solutions to sorting out some of Zambia's most pressing needs that could be related to the provision of water and sanitation services, streamlining interventions that support a stronger energy security, securing of that, and ultimately being very proactive in terms of addressing climate impacts by strengthening the sponge effect of the Lukanga. I must also be quick to say, Stuart, that the demonstration of that support from the Zambian government is also seen not just in the context of the Lukanga swamps, but also politically. We've been able to get support for them to lead a championing of nature-based solutions for the Africa region. And you do know now that we just had a change in government. That means that we are hoping that the Zambian government would assume some kind of leadership even within the AU space for demonstrating why Africa as a region needs to scale up in terms of adoption of nature-based solutions. My last submission in terms of the demonstration of that commitment is also that the Zambian government has basically re-establish and get a little bit more support for the possible implementation of a debt for nature swap. And to us, it shows that they are slowly accepting more innovative ways of addressing even macroeconomic challenges related to the high debt situation that we have in Zambia. So in a nutshell, I would say yes. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Isabel. We had a bit of a shaky connection there, but we got most of that. So, but I think what you're saying there is super important, that it's not just that these are great projects from the perspective of, say, WWF. I think that the societal challenge has been, an argument has been made, the government has recognized it, but the fact that they want to take this and be champions for these kinds of projects into COP and other events, I think is extremely exciting. So thank you for that. Andre, I'm going to come to you next. You represent the private sector. On Bernard's last slide, he talked about the need for greater collaboration and stakeholders. And I think all the presentations made that clear, that the private sector has to be deeply involved in these kinds of large-scale NBS. Do you think that companies are ready to seize this opportunity to build resilience for their business and more broadly for society? Andre? It's okay. It's okay. Andre, are you with us? There you go. Okay, I don't know what's going on here. I think we're just going to keep moving on here. Andre, give me a wave if you can if you can take that question and join back. What I'm going to do now is generally go back to the panelists. So we'll come back to you, Brehia, and just ask you a general question. And the question is going to apply to everybody. But what do you see as the main challenges of developing these ambitious large-scale NBS projects? You touched on some of it, but could you go a little deeper into what do you think are the main challenges here?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the main challenges is development and of course population pressure. And then the main challenge probably is not a very nice one because that's so easy to solve, but I think it's institutional and the way that we're used to sort of arrange and organize things. We're very sectorally divided. I think that's normal in every country. If I look at the Dutch government, and most governments have a Ministry of Infrastructure, of Environment, and for good nature-based solutions and to scale up on a large scale and to actually conserve and value nature, all these agencies need to interact.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think that we see that everywhere. Justine, do you have any thoughts on that question from where you've been working in the Mekong?
Yeah, I think I'm mainly going to echo the points that have already been made. We see that there is a ton of expertise, both on the ground with people who, the stakeholders that we have not yet had a chance to speak with, people who know the work that they're doing just day to day, community members, you have governments, you have business networks, you have scientists, and everyone has a different perspective. And I think just finding the venues and the means to bring people together to collaboratively problem solve, but also to look forward, it is a real challenge. And, in some ways, the COVID pandemic has brought us closer together in this virtual space, but it's also made it much harder. For example, my distance here in New York from being on the ground in Vietnam.
Right.
That's a very big gap, especially right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Bernard, you touched on this in your presentation about some of the barriers that you've seen, but it sounds to me from your position that you're very close to policymakers. What do you think are some of the other challenges that you see, Bernard? You're on mute. There we go.
Can you repeat the question, sir, please?
Yeah, sorry. You touched on it in your presentation, but it was really about the barriers to implementation. So what do you see as the main challenges to these, to getting to large scale, ambitious level of NBS?
I think good examples are very important to provoke a mindset, a change in the mindset. We need successful stories, and based on this, we can scale up the needed changes. That's why, for instance, in Brussels, the previous Ministry of Environment, she was organizing visits for political stakeholders and also people from the private sector to visit very good examples in other countries and to show it, showing it works, and it's less expensive and it has side benefits, social benefits, and so on. And what the next step is that we need a big change in the legal framework. The legal framework, for instance, about urban planning, does not at this time. I'm speaking for Belgium, but it's also quite similar in other countries. It does not take into account the role of water,
right,
and the protection of water, and this has to be changed urgently.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, very clear. Thank you, Bernard. Andre, you're back with us. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear you. Oh, there. Can you say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Andre, good. Glad you're with us. Andre, I wanted to kind of build on the point that Bernard was stating in his last slide, where he was talking about greater cooperation. I think all of the presentations made it clear that the private sector has to be deeply involved in these kinds of large-scale NBS projects. Do you think that companies are ready to seize this kind of opportunity to build resilience for their business and more broadly? And if not, what do you think is still required?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential. I don't think we have a choice to invest in nature-based solutions as part of the overall watershed health commitment that we all have to show. Clearly, we we are always interested as in both the business case and the science case. And it's surprisingly hard to do both. So, you know, the business case, you need a longer term perspective to understand the returns. And the returns are not always directly only to the company, but also even the science base is not always in a way that it's easy for a company to digest. If I invest upstream in reforestation, now, is that good or bad for downstream water health, etc.? So that's important, but none of that should stop us. And we've seen that with some of our work with WWF, for instance, in the George region, the Hopsgrain region in South Africa, where we've been investing together for over a decade, where it wasn't long in the ecosystem restoration work that local farm managers, etc., say, I can see the impact. I can see water flowing out of the mountain that I haven't seen for a decade. So the physical evidence was there, but it's taken both us and WWF quite some time to get to a point where you can actually start demonstrating that on a business case and a science base. So we're covering a short case study in our website today, if anybody's interested, on AB InBev, on a decade of work with WWF. So absolutely, I think the science case and the business case are important, but none of that should stop us. We know all instinctively this is the right thing to do, and we should do that. And the last thing I want to say is the importance of shifting from just mitigation in terms of thinking around investment in terms of water as adaptation. And I can see a big risk, you know, even with some of our decarbonization efforts, there are incentives to invest in projects, in very specific projects that will give us both water and carbon benefits, but those are not necessarily what's required locally. So I just want to emphasize the importance of starting with landscape and watershed issues first, and then finding the right solutions, rather than where there's a temptation in the private sector to grab a project because it gives us water accounting and carbon accounting benefits. Thank you.
Great points. Thank you, Andre. I'm going to go to a next question to the panelists, but I'm going to start with Isabel, if you can still hear me, Isabel. But one of the participants, sorry, one of the people listening in today has asked this question. While it's encouraging to hear that governments are supporting NBS solutions, for example, the case in Zambia, is this commitment matched with appropriate funding commitments? So I think a question to you first, Isabel, and then to everybody else is, how are we going to finance this? So Isabel, can you answer that one?
Yes, thank you for the question. And it was one of the key responses I was going to give to your earlier question on issues around challenges to the implementation of nature-based solutions. So generally, there is a financing challenge around getting governments to sort of commit to implementing very clear nature-based solutions that will tackle one of our most pressing challenges, which is climate at the moment. In the Zambian context, I think that whilst we've been able to secure the political will, one of our bigger problems has been that we currently have a very constrained fiscal space. What that means is that at the national level, it is almost difficult for government to commit specific financing at present from domestic revenue resources that can be channeled into any kind of NBS work. What that means is that the WWF Zambia needs to play a very central role in showing how innovative financing mechanisms can support the implementation of nature-based solutions. And in the context of specific ecosystems, moving away from the Lukanga, one of the things that we've tried to do is to point government to implementing clear landscape financing plans as one way of streamlining and creating a very clear investment pathway for the private sector to bring in the much needed resources that we need. And this is because we fully understand our context. And if our advocacy is centered much around getting domestic revenue into the space, it may take, so at the heart of the increasing.
Sorry about that, folks. I've had to just mute that one. Sorry, Isabel, we've got very bad bandwidth issues with you today, and I don't think we could finish that. But what you said up to that point was extremely relevant and really important points. Brahia or Justine, I know you're far away from the projects and you're assessing them from afar, but what about the financing or the funding aspects of this or other projects you've been involved in as far as large-scale MBS? Do you have any insights?
Yeah, I agree with Isabel though on the Lukanga and on the Zambia case. Very good remarks, and there's a big opportunity there. Yeah, I think there's tons of funding opportunities. We only have to sort of get straight how to form that project pipeline and get the funding in the right place, I think, and invest in right initiatives. But I see very promising results also in the bigger development banks. They start investing in MBS and in these type of green solutions, which actually makes available a very big amount of funding. I think funding will not be the problem, but more how to sort of use the funding in a good way and to stop incentives that are actually pushing us in the wrong direction.
Right. Great. I think that's right. Justine?
Yeah, I think, you know, this project and also the Building with Nature initiative that Brahia and I are both involved in different ways, there are a lot of projects that are trying to develop the case for funding, and that's kind of the stage that we're at. You know, we're not necessarily ready to implement the project. And I think one of the challenges that we see is finding different scales of funding for different kinds of projects. And what we'd like to see more is investment in pilot projects. It's something that a lot of people have talked about here, so that we have the demonstration, the examples really, and then we can scale up and look at larger scale projects. But really where we are in the Mekong Delta project and some of the other work that we're doing in our office is about developing a clear proposition so that we can begin conversations about what funding is available, mainly through development banks, but it could also be through national governments or other entities.
Terrific. Thanks, Justine. Bernard, from a utility perspective, what do you say about the financing question on what you're proposing? Don't forget to unmute.
Okay. It's a big change in financial flows and sources, as I said. That's to say, my company, for instance, was only busy with pipes and is in charge of fight against flooding. But if we change the way to do it with nature-based solutions, the investments which has to be made concerns the public spaces, the streets, the land, the country. And this is not the same financial flows. So we need a new legal framework to make it possible that, for instance, a water operator can finance solutions which are less expensive at the end than the gray solutions we use to actually, and to make it possible that we can finance those nature-based solutions on a larger scale. So it's, and I think we could have also a support in this direction by the European Bank, which is financing many of the water operators in Europe.
Right. Very good. Andre, I want to pose the same question to you on finance. If you have any thoughts on where do you think private sector finance might be available for these kinds of projects? If you're still with us, it seems that we're having some bandwidth problems today. Are you still there? Okay, thanks.
Was that directed at me?
Yeah, I'll reiterate the question just in case. So, I mean, on the back of this discussion of financing large-scale MBS, obviously the large money's got to come from government. We need the grant money. We need to build the pipeline. Do you think that the private sector has an appetite to put money on the table for this stuff?
Absolutely. And I think the case study that I mentioned earlier in South Africa with in the hops growing region was a classic case study where we had upfront investment from GIZ, which was really helpful together with WWF. Over time, the South African government matched probably 2 to 1 the funding overall. But the key is putting that all together. And I think that's the challenge for organizations like WWF and others, is the private sector is not great in putting that together, because the sequencing of that money wasn't always right. When the government had money to spend urgently, the project wasn't in the right pace, or when the project was ready to scale, the government money wasn't available. So it does help the private sector has discretionary resource, and I don't think we always realize the value of that. Governments have so many regulations, and rightfully so, where the private sector can easily say, well, is it research, is it pilot, is it scale up, what's required here? And I think we can do a lot better as the private sector to realize that. But we need someone to stitch these things together, otherwise they really stop and start.
Right, absolutely understood. I mean, I think building on that point, and this is for everybody, we're going into the climate COP. The UK and the US is pledging billions towards climate adaptation. And I'm hearing from everybody in every chat room that I'm in Stockholm that there's lots of money, but we need a pipeline of projects. That's something that we know very, very well. And we're trying to build a pipeline of projects. But how are we going to get those people with the billions to pay attention to our pipeline of projects? how do we stand out above the crowd a little bit to make sure that somebody says, hey, this is actually a good idea? I like the idea of storytelling, but I think there's actually really good ideas on the table. You guys have given some really concrete ones. There's tons of other well-established and emergent opportunities. What do we need to do to make sure that that we can attract the kind of funding that is out there? Any thoughts?
Should I go? I have some thoughts, because Justine already mentioned the EcoShape consortium, but what you could do, I think, is and Andre just said we're not strong enough to do this as the private sector alone. So you should form strategic alliances and team up. So this I mentioned the cross-sectoral or the division between different sectors. You could already solve that as parties in the field. So make alliances with the engineering sector as the nature conservation sector, with research, with research and academic science also, but also with the contractors in the private sector, and then also with financiers and policymakers.
Okay.
And we've done that a bit in the EcoShape consortium, and it works well, and it makes everybody stronger. It's too difficult a problem to tackle by yourself, I think.
Great. Any thoughts? Great. Isabel, I don't know if you're still with us. We'll see if you come off mute. Okay. We're winding down now. We've got, I think, 2 minutes before we close out today. Great presentations. Any last thoughts from any of you about where we need to take this going forward as a community, as a water community? What do we need to do differently to get people to come and listen to what we have to say about this? Any thoughts? I can't believe I'm not. Justine, go for it.
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, but I think, as we're talking about development banks and governments and the private sector, we also have to remember that there's on the ground action from stakeholders and community members. And so we really need to bridge the gap and continue to think about bottom-up approaches as well as top-down funding.
Fantastic, great. Isabel, you got your hand raised, and I'm eager to give you the floor because you got cut off earlier, so please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to raise perhaps one or two aspects as some concluding remarks. The issue of ownership on the NBS agenda, I think for me is critical. I'm not sure about other regions, how that plays out, but in our context, it's almost like an
Oh dear. Oh dear, sorry about that.
Keep selling to the guys. There are not very many conversations.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The bandwidth from Zambia is very poor. I apologize. Bernard, I think you were just going to say a final thing. and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, Stuart, thank you. I really think that we are going as I am speaking at the size of the water operators. I think our very good practices, we have to scale up the change of those practices between the companies, between the countries, and so we can step up on the gap even faster, because we really have to scale it up in a very short period of time.
Agreed. Sorry, Bernard, I'm gonna have to stop you there because we're gonna get cut off automatically here. And I just want to give a chance to thank all of you guys for absolutely fantastic presentations today. I apologize to you and the audience for some of the bandwidth issues we had, but I think the main points were made very clearly. Great examples. We encourage anybody who's listening to connect with us, join with us. But again, thank you to the presenters today. You did a fantastic job, and I'm really excited about where we're going with this agenda. And I think on the back of COP, let's hope that we can start to move these forward into real projects with a real impact. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great water week. Cheers now. Thank you.